Okay, I think we'll get started today. Again, thank you for logging in. This is a webinar that's presented by the North Carolina Training and Technical Assistance Center, but it's really driven by the Alcohol Drug Council of North Carolina. So we're just really excited that you're here today. But we do have a few housekeeping items. We're expecting a large group today. So all attendees are automatically placed on mute. If you would like to participate in the webinar, please simply raise your hand or place a question. This is our preferable method, is to place a question or item in the question box. And we have staff in the background monitoring questions. This webinar is being recorded, so just wanted to let everybody know that. And will be available for viewing hopefully by tomorrow, if not sooner, after processing. Let's see. I'm Jamie Edwards. I'm director of the Training and Technical Assistance Center here in North Carolina. Sitting beside me is Curtis Taylor. Curtis is executive director of the Alcohol Drug Council of North Carolina.
Good morning.
And hopefully everybody can see us. We're actually in Winston-Salem, and we have another staff person, Stacy Stotler, who will be joining us via audio only. And I believe Stacy's making sure her connection is solid right now. And Stacy, can you? Yes. Thank you, Stacy.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, we have some other folks on the screen as well that Curtis will be introducing in just a few minutes, who will be serving as part of our panel section for the webinar. And during the panel section, this is where we really want to encourage participation and questions and some give and take, because we realize the more interactive a webinar can be, the more meaningful it is generally. So we do have some goals for this webinar. This is a part 2 of a webinar that we presented in November related to the same topic of making connections between prevention and recovery. This is the second stage. And our goal is to convey the importance of making these connections between prevention practice and with the recovery community. The recovery community and individuals who work into the prevention field are really natural partners in our efforts to reduce the negative impact of substance use in our communities. We have a panel. This webinar is really divided up into 3 sectors. We will speak of prevention and recovery topics, have a panel type experience, and then introduce a 2.0 type version of a document the Alcohol Drug Council has produced with the intent of helping recovery professionals learn more, or the recovery community learn more about the prevention field.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for getting us started, and thank you everyone for joining into today's presentation. Again, we want this to be as interactive as possible, so please, by all means, chime in with your questions, and we'll make sure we either provide the answer or we'll get back to you with some answers. So basically, prevention and recovery walk hand in hand, and I think we can all agree that our voices are much stronger when we all speak together. Over the years, I've heard so many people complain that we operate in silos, so to speak. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. You got 3, 4, 5 different agencies all attempting to do the exact same thing at different times, reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So the state of North Carolina, the division staff, Jessica Dickin, who's the prevention chief, Dee Dee Severino, who's the recovery head down at the state, they have really emphasized the integration of prevention professionals and the recovery community and treatment professionals for that matter. And so my agency, the Alcohol Drug Council of North Carolina, along with the North Carolina Training and Technical Assistance Center, we're doing our part to kind of push that message forward, make these connections and collaborations. So I'm excited about the panelists that we have to speak today. I'm excited about this topic of discussion.
Okay, we will spend just a few minutes talking about and better defining prevention and recovery prior to the beginning of the panel experience. And we have, just on the slide, indicators of what prevention is. Prevention is a profession, it's a field of study, a mindset, and actions taken. But what does that really mean? Those are some really vague defining features. Let's drill that down just a tad bit more, especially for individuals who may be in the audience who this could be the first experience that you're learning about prevention in a formal way. And prevention can take many forms, professionally and otherwise. Prevention can be classroom-based teaching. In the prevention field, we call that prevention education. It can be community organizing around a cause that's really important to the community at large. In prevention terms, this is called community-based process. It could be advocacy for public policy changes. Prevention is really a broad field of study and a broad professional skill set as well. Prevention is built out of research and the medical model, specifically the medical model when we speak of addiction and substance use. And we can all find examples of prevention messages that's around us. We can think of the really effective tobacco messages that were deployed in the late 90s, early 2000s to reduce the numbers of individuals who were using tobacco, especially minors. We can think about drunk driving efforts to reduce the occurrence of drunk driving in our communities. Those are examples, really public examples, of very large prevention efforts at a population level. Prevention can also be at very, very small levels within your zip code, within your community coalition, within your neighborhood, addressing a variety of topics. Prevention is intended to identify those issues within communities, those issues that are impacting the health and livelihood and success of communities at large, and finding ways to help communities build their capacity to address those social issues. It's a very broad topic. And one of the lessons for me, and I've been in the prevention field for many, many years, when I talk with community members and even my family members about what I do, and we speak of what prevention is, sometimes it's really hard to define that and to express the breadth and the depth of their willingness to help communities improve their standing, their social standing, and their health standing at the individual level and at the large-scale population level.
Thank you, Jamie. So now we'll talk about recovery. So for the purpose of today's webinar, the definition of recovery we're going to utilize comes from our federal government, who put a lot of time and energy into creating a definition of recovery. So recovery can be defined as a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. So obviously, there can be many definitions of recovery, but this is the one that we'll use to kind of unite our discussion today And hopefully this will suffice to unite our discussion and the recovery movement, the integration of prevention and recovery movement moving forward. So just like prevention, recovery is also a profession. That includes counselors, psychiatrists, and even peer support. Recovery is also a field of study. Most people know it as addiction science. The National Institute on Drug Abuse states, we believe that increased understanding of the basics of addiction will empower people to make informed choices in their own lives, adopt science-based policies and programs that reduce substance misuse in their communities, and support scientific research that improves the nation's well-being. Recovery as a mindset, we like to focus on the fact that there are multiple pathways to recovery. So there's multiple solutions to sustain recovery. Everyone has to find their own unique pathway to recovery. There is no one-size-fits-all. And action steps in recovery can refer to simply setting and accomplishing goals. Recovery also involves finding new and creative ways to nourish and enrich one's life in a healthy manner.
Okay. And again, Curtis provided a formal definition of recovery. This is, you may see on your screen now, a formal definition of prevention provided by the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention at the federal level. Again, prevention is a proactive process that empowers individuals and systems to meet the challenges of life events and those transitions that may be occurring in their lives by creating conditions that promote healthy behaviors and lifestyles. William Lofgren, that's a quote, he's considered one of the fathers of modern prevention thought for the past couple of decades. But what does this really mean? Let's unpack this just a tad. We're speaking of empowering individuals and communities at large to consider and to help them promote healthy behavior and healthy lifestyles, healthy decision-making within their own existence. And one of the most important items, I believe, that we can remember about prevention is, and one of those comparisons to recovery that can help new individuals who are joining this prevention conversation, is that prevention can exist at the individual level and at the society level. And this is really important to understand, and it's not necessarily one size fits all. So prevention is proactive. Effective prevention meets the needs of the community and the individuals who make up those communities. Prevention empowers individuals and communities to be ready to address the challenges that life throws at them. And of course, which is the primary message, is prevention encourages healthy behaviors and healthy lifestyles and healthy choices. And hopefully prevention also helps sustain those choices and those lifestyles.
Okay, so that's just reiterating our formal definition of recovery.
Okay. Curtis and I will double team on this slide just a tad. This slide attempts to make a brief comparison in terms of the defining features again of prevention and recovery. Note the similarities and note some of the differences in these definitions. A really important point related to the prevention definition is the belief, again, that prevention work can occur at the individual level and the population level with the primary goal of improving health status. And the best solutions, the best prevention work out there is based on evidence, on prior research of what we know works in other communities. Yet, at the same time, we must make sure that good work, that prior evidence, those evidence-based processes and practices are really good cultural fits for the population that we're serving. Sometimes we miss that in society at large. We may see an excellent prevention program that was extremely successful in a community next door or a community 10 states away. And we fail to ask, is this approach relevant, realistic, and appropriate based on the cultural norms of the communities that we're serving? So prevention attempts to make connections between best practice and cultural responsivity at the same time.
Well said, well said. And I'm sure, you can immediately see that recovery pretty much does the exact same thing. Both prevention and recovery are both a process. Obviously prevention, I guess, is trying to get upstream, so to speak, to prevent things from taking place. But both prevention and recovery both put forth effort to just simply result in healthier lifestyles, both on the individual level and also on a community level. Really, the major differences, if there are any, would just simply involve the systems that we both work in, from one day to the next. Prevention professionals might find themselves in some different settings as opposed to people working in the recovery field. But that is changing. I see that changing every single day. As director of my agency, I'm fortunate enough to get the opportunity to work with prevention professionals, recovery professionals, and treatment professionals, even harm reduction folks. So I see us all beginning to work together, and as a result, more and more people are getting the help they so desperately need. So there's a distinct compatibility of both of these fields. While one focuses on the individual's journey and the other supports the individual's journey by impacting the systems and the conditions. So I think as a person in long-term recovery, it's imperative that I educate myself about the prevention profession and learn how to integrate that science-based approach to impacting our total community in a healthy manner.
This is a small graphic that discusses who does prevention. Who are these folks out there? And you can see on the chart, it's a really broad list of individuals, categories, professions, and so forth. Prevention is holistic. Really good prevention efforts doesn't operate in silos, as Curtis mentioned, especially within our sister professions in terms of the treatment field, recovery field, and so forth, even harm reduction now. Effective prevention leverages the unique talents and skills of our fellow professionals and the community at large. Prevention is really based on the ideas of action research. And action research takes two perspectives. One is using the best practice material that we have in academic research, and we attempt to turn that into real activity in the community. It's just not academic in nature. That we don't want to leave the best of the best in terms of what we've learned from other communities on the shelf and not implement some of those ideas in our communities. We want to take that research and see where the levels of applicability are to do good work based on that research in our communities. Also, prevention is action-oriented by sharing what we learn in our communities. We may create our own internal and local best practices that really work in our communities that could be duplicated or shared with the community next door or with the recovery community, for example. So prevention has always been a really exciting field for me because as a former academic, I was in the academic world for a long time, and seldom were we able to see the real fruits of our labor in the community, where the entire prevention field is based off of the idea of using formal research and science to inform daily practice. So we're able to test out those ideas, to run prevention models, and to check our level of effectiveness and let that inform other communities at large. And it's really an exciting opportunity.
Jamie's right. This really is an exciting opportunity, and so now I want to talk about who does recovery. So every single time that a person in recovery shares their story with an audience, and that audience has not yet developed a substance use disorder, that person is indeed supporting prevention. Our stories are not used as scare tactics. That's been proven to be ineffective. But our stories do provide education, and they also give perspective. Every single time a person in recovery commits to raising their children in a healthy way, they are supporting prevention efforts by establishing protective factors in that child's life. People have both biological and or psychological characteristics, that can make them vulnerable or resilient to potential behavioral health problems. So protective factors include positive self-image, self-control, emotional regulation, and social competency. So you and I on a daily basis, the teachers in our schools on a daily basis, parents just setting a healthy example for their children. Every single one of those folks, if they're a person in recovery, they're also participating in prevention. So we will now transition into our panel discussion, which is the ultimate purpose of today's webinar, is to talk about unique ways and successes that people are having out there in the field right now today, integrating prevention with recovery. So our first panelist I have the honor to introduce is Mr. Joe Marks, who is himself a person in long-term and sustained recovery, and he's also serving as an ambassador for the North Carolina ABC Commission's Talk It Out campaign for the prevention of underage drinking. Joe? Does he need to unmute?
Yeah, make sure that you unmute, Joe.
Wait, let's start over again, Joe.
There we go.
You know, I could have an excuse, but that's before I got into recovery, so no excuses. I was just forgot to hit the unmute button. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Chris, for also joining the panel. Chris is one of my heroes. When I first got into going to conferences throughout the state, Chris was always there, and he was always someone who I just admired for his wealth of information and his always willingness to share that from the heart. So, Chris, thank you for being a panelist as well. Great introduction to this. Like Curtis said, I am a person in long-term sustained recovery. And what recovery brought me to is a position also, one for a period of time as an executive director for the homeless in a town of Morganton. And you talk about prevention. One of the things that prevention can really, when it comes to substance use disorders and even mental health issues, that we can get our arms around the trauma that people have experienced in their lives, which often leads to some sort of disorder. Homelessness is one of those, and so often with working with a number of men and women with children, I had to step back and find some help to give them a roof over their head and some food in their belly before we could even begin to work on any sort of substance use. So the whole idea of getting people and getting them taken care of was something that helped obviously work with different issues as well. That led to a position for me with Burke Recovery, which is a small substance use disorder agency. And that also led to prevention, because as executive director there, wrote a grant, a SAMHSA grant, the Partnership for Success, which is a prevention grant around opioid use and preventing opioid use around prescription medications with youth and young adults. My eyes really opened to see the similarities between recovery and prevention. You know, before this world of recovery and prevention, I was a vice president in advertising for a major newspaper in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which really led and was a perfect grounds for advancing my addiction, so to speak. I was paid to entertain people with alcohol, and the more the better, usually. Before that, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, where it's not a controlled state. I'm really understanding the difference between a controlled state and a non-controlled state. I remember moving to North Carolina and wondering what were these ABC stores. Well, that in itself is prevention. And that in itself is recovery, because it talks that this is really something, alcohol needs to be controlled. I grew up where alcohol was glorified. My mother, obviously, well, not obvious to you, but to me, a real alcoholic, loving woman. But boy, she just really loved to drink. My dad, as I was in this field, I understood that he really suffered from untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, and he drank heavily as to medicate that. Most people in those situations think and grow up saying, I don't want to be anything like my mom or my dad. I couldn't wait to be like my mom and my dad. I couldn't wait to do that. So when I started drinking, I drank heavily and often. And I often wonder, and when I'm telling my story, I often tell people, I go, you know, if I had a parent, if I had a coach, if I had a counselor, if I had someone in my life, besides my Uncle L driving 120 miles an hour through a small town, drunk on his butt, and me laughing like an idiot. If I had someone talking to me about that really, and how drinking can, or the use of drugs at any age, but particularly at an early age, how that can really impact my life going forward, how differently my life might be today. And I didn't have those messages. I didn't have those images. My life was not filled with a lot of protective factors when it came to the use of alcohol and or drugs. It was really filled with a lot of risk behaviors. Now, one of the things that I have to add to that is that because I grew up in a very loving family, I was able to glean and hang on to that sense of commitment to another, which I lost through my addiction. And where prevention and treatment and recovery and harm reduction really come together is through health and wellness, through a real holistic approach. One of the things that I believe where they also stand really closely hand in hand is to give anyone and everyone the opportunity, and this is just going to expand a little bit on the definition of both prevention and recovery, the opportunity to really be a participant in their life. Today, I'm able to be part of my life. I'm able to wake up in the morning, usually pre-dawn, and just sit and just find gratitude for being alive. When I was in my addiction, that wasn't possible. I didn't realize that those things were possible. I didn't realize that there were things that I needed to do in my life and skills that I needed to learn to cope with life, and so that I could live life on life's terms and get to that point where I could really appreciate not only who I was, but who the world and what the world around me is. So being connected and staying connected is really critical. Giving youth, young adults, anyone alternatives to a way of life. One of the things as an ambassador for the ABC Commission, we really encourage coaches, counselors, teachers, parents to really talk to kids about, what's going on in their life, and also the ills of drinking and using at any age, but particularly at an early age, and how that really has an impact on the brain. One of the things that I've been doing is, through recovery, I go to a retreat twice a year in the spring and the fall at Camp Greer. It's called Veda Makam, and it's a wonderful retreat. But having had the opportunity to get really involved with that retreat, I've also gotten to know the director and assistant director at the camp. And they bring in kids from throughout North Carolina to come and do different things. And in this past spring, I had conversation with the assistant director, and he said, it's just been a few years ago that this place almost fell, and we almost lost everything. And I just asked the question, what made the difference? And he said a guy by the name of Jason. I won't mention his last name, but anyhow, because I don't remember it, that's why I won't mention it. But what he did is, Jason said, you can bring these kids to camp and they can sit around the campfire and sing Kumbaya for just so long. And then they're going to go off and do something else. They're not going to come back. But if you bring them to camp and you give them other things to do, you give them horses to ride on, you give them zip lines, you give them rock climbing, you give them kayaking, you give them these other things, they get excited about their life. And so I've had the opportunity to spend, every week I go for a day and spend time not only talking about the drinking and what that can do and using what that can do, but really learning from them on how to participate in their life. And so at a really young age, these kids coming to that camp are really learning how to connect to each other, connect to the earth, and find alternative and really fun and growing things to do outside of drinking and using. I had written up a bunch of stuff that I was going to go over, and I haven't even gotten to that yet. So I'm gonna end now because I think I'm running out of time here. But prevention, treatment, harm reduction, recovery, we're all coming from the same place. We're looking for wellness, and we're looking for health for all. And like Curtis said, there are many different pathways to that. A lot of words that come to mind, being connected, staying connected, connecting. At a conference not too long ago, I was sitting and listening to a panel, and they talked about nothing about us without us. So trust, relationships, collaboration, coalition, so critical to this work on a community level. Hope, trust, accountability, responsibility, to learn those things throughout life and to continue to be responsible and accountable. And we're all accountable to carry this message, and we're all responsible to carry this message. And one of the biggest things I think each of us can do as an individual is to really work to break the negative and adverse negative perception around substance use. That you get to a point in your addiction, and if you have a medical condition, and it's not a moral failing. Because something that kept me out of treatment for a long time was the whole idea that I thought I was just a terrible person, and there was something terribly wrong with me, and there's nothing that I could do. I worked in Minneapolis, St. Paul for a number of years, 30 minutes away from one of the premier treatment facilities in the world, Hazelden. I didn't know there was a solution. So for all of us to be responsible, for all of us to be open, and for all of us to help each other and hold each other, we have a beautiful life ahead of us, and that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you for being such a shining example of a person in recovery that's doing prevention work every single day. Thank you again. Next, I have the honor of introducing my good friend, Mr. Troy Mann, who is the statewide manager of advocacy and education at Recovery Communities of North Carolina, also known as RCNC. Thank you, Troy.
Thank you guys for having me, man. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. This is pretty cool to me. Yeah. It's funny, I'm in the middle of a Recovery Coach Academy. Chris, we got some of your people over here.
Yeah, they're excited and enjoying it.
Good, man. Good. So yeah, I was looking over some things I was going to bring to the table and why prevention is important in recovery work. Well, as Joe was talking, I think they tie in together. And I just think back in my own recovery process of coming up, how so much shame and guilt was tied to addiction, and it was never looked at as a medical issue. It was always looked at as a moral issue. And with my position, being able to travel around and do messaging training, what I've found is that a lot of parents who have lost kids due to overdose, one of the reasons they did not reach out is because of the stigma that's attached to addiction. So I think when you're talking about prevention and recovery coming together, it's important that we work together, number one, to kill any stigma that's attached to anyone seeking help, whether they are 50 years old or 15 years old. We need to work together to help the world understand that it's not a moral issue, but it is a medical issue. And to also, for the people that are in recovery, what we found as individuals who are outspoken about our own recovery, it helps us to be able to talk to other people about some of the mistakes that we've made and how we, how we got to this point in our own recovery. It's nothing like being able to share with a group of kids or parents about my own process and the things that we faced when I was at that point in my life. Also, I think another thing is teaching people about the language that we use is very important. Just having conversations with people who are not familiar with the recovery movement, they don't really understand why language is so important. And I think language is detrimental to the process of change and us being able to get into schools and get into places where we wouldn't normally be because the language carries such stigma with it. So getting people to understand the importance of language, even if they're not in the recovery process themselves, developing more recovery allies. And I've learned that allies open a lot of doors for us to be able to carry the message. And just working with law enforcement, EMS, and people who are working towards the opioid crisis and helping others and getting everybody to speak with one voice. So for me, prevention and recovery goes hand in hand when we're talking about one voice and one language that we're using together. That's what I come up with to bring to the table.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Troy, for such a rich discussion. We also appreciate you taking time out of your Recovery Coach Academy this morning to spend some time with us. It's unfortunate you won't be around for the Q&A, but if any questions are directed specifically towards you, we'll make sure those get emailed to you so that you can respond.
Yeah, and again, I mean, thanks for having me, man. I'm sorry that I have to dip out, but they are waiting on me patiently, and Chris's people was looking at me like they was ready to jump on me.
Well, we don't want that, so we'll let you get back to it. But thank you so much, Troy.
Okay, thank you guys, man.
Thanks, Troy.
Thanks, Troy.
So last but not least, I I'm honored to introduce a friend and mentor to me for many years. And the gentleman, as far as I know, he's the gentleman that invented the term recovery ally, Mr. Chris Butnick of Healing Transitions. Chris?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Jamie Curtis, excellent job in prepping Joe and Troy and I for this. Joe, thank you for your kind words. And Troy, I've had many texts from staff about what they're getting out of Recovery Coach Academy this week, and really excited about the opportunity for them to participate. That I was introduced to recovery in 1987, engaged in treatment in 1989, got into recovery in 1990, had no intention of staying in recovery, but have managed to do so. Got into the treatment field and professionally in 1993, and I've probably spent the last 14 years trying to unlearn the bad habits and bad practices of the first 11 years in the field. And one of the things that has stood out to me in this conversation is silos. And for the longest time, we weren't even thinking about silos outside of the treatment recovery sphere. We were thinking of the silos just simply within the treatment field and the recovery communities, that things were really siloed in terms of pathway, what type of treatment modality, and so forth. And it's a positive evolution to see us kind of break down those silos within this field and start seeing the fact that there's silos between other areas such as prevention and so forth. And so it was, I think, March of last year, there was a first kind of state group or meeting that Joe and I were able to participate in with Jamie, focused on kind of bringing these two, circles together and talking about commonalities and so forth. And I think, prevention's not my area of expertise, and so my thoughts on it are just kind of based on what my experiences have been. But I think of prevention in a number of terms. One is the idea of reducing suffering and extending wellness. And what we say within the addiction treatment field is we should have a goal of shortening somebody's addiction career. And by doing that, we're extending the length of their recovery career. So within treatment, we've done a really poor job of getting people engaged in services, providing them with the adequate supports and resources post-treatment to be successful. And kind of as a consequence, the system is set up that engages people at later stages of illness severity and problem complexity. And the consequence is that that individual, their family, their community has that person in addiction for a longer period of time before they experience recovery. And then the next thing that we've kind of recognized is that there's often things we overlook once people get into recovery that can also shorten their recovery life or their recovery career, such as nicotine addiction and so forth. The most exciting thing and promising thing that has come about with the opioid crisis has really been, groups who historically have not worked together coming together. And that really benefits everyone. So as we've seen, and I would say Healing Transitions a number of years ago, I had somebody from RPD come to me and say, hey, we're dealing with a lot of overdoses and we've created a survey and we want you to give us feedback on this survey because we want to get information not just about, their source or supply, but how they became addicted and what that experience is like. And my first reaction was kind of like, yeah, all right. So we looked at it and it was like, this is legit. They're like really doing some serious thinking about it. And then they said, could we come interview some of your participants with opioid history and kind of get some of their input? And I was like, yeah, we can see about that. And it was totally, it wasn't like just they're coming in trying to get sources or anything. There was this legitimate desire to understand the problem. As we've heard a lot of people kind of say from the law enforcement perspective, that this is not a problem that we will arrest ourselves out of. So seeing things like that, where law enforcement starts working more closely with treatment and recovery, and also a bridge with harm reduction to treatment and recovery, and you know, people who are first responders and so forth. These have been some of the exciting things that and promising things that have come from the opioid crisis, and it's something for us to, for me, I believe, to keep in mind that, you know, when the opioid crisis, you know, is surpassed by the next drug crisis or drug epidemic, and when the face of that epidemic changes, like, it's going to be really important that we're intentional about maintaining those alliances and those relationships, and not get back into how we've responded to other epidemics in the past that haven't shown that type of collaboration and haven't promoted opportunities for people to get health and wellness. The points of success and inspiration is one thing that Jamie and Curtis asked me to think about. And I think, you know, to this, one of the first things that comes to mind is an experience I had in 2017 in Waynesville. They were holding their, I believe at that time, third Western Regional Recovery Rally. And it was at Lake Junacaluska. And what I was struck with, and what has stayed with me from participating in that event, was that there were adolescents participating in the walk, and they were most of them were identifying themselves as, I'm a recovery ally, or saying that they had signs that said, I support somebody in recovery, I love someone in recovery. And it made a real big impression upon me, because I began to wonder what it would be like for folks to be in that community, to be an adolescent who was struggling, and to see peers who were conveying messages of being supportive of recovery and being recovery allies. And I just had to believe that that would make it easier for another adolescent to reach out and ask for help, to feel like their chance for reducing their own suffering by engaging in some sort of community can only be enhanced when that community is welcoming and embracing, and not shunning or alienating. And I was just so impressed by that. And I didn't, to clarify, I did not create the recovery ally term, but we're really fortunate that, you know, our current recovery movement, you know, goes back, this kind of version goes back to the early 2000s, and an important summit that happened in St. Paul, Minnesota, that led to the formation of Faces and Voices of Recovery, which basically says it's important for for people in recovery to put a face and voice to recovery, so that people began to see that one, recovery is possible, that people with addiction are worth investing in, and that people deserve second chances. And they created the recovery messaging training, which said which kind of the innovation was, the recovery community was defined very broadly. It was not defined as just the person in recovery, but the recovery community is comprised by the person that's in recovery, by their friends and families, and by allies. And the nice thing about the ally kind of designation is, I think that people who work in treatment a lot don't see themselves as part of the recovery community, or don't know where their voice is with that. And it gives them the opportunity to speak up and say, I'm an ally. You know, I'm an ally to people who are in recovery. And the second thing about the ally designation is that for people who are in recovery and it's not safe for them to disclose their own recovery status, they can still adopt a recovery ally identity and status. So my timer says I've been talking for 9 minutes and 20 seconds, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Chris. It is always such a pleasure to work with you. as well as Joe and Troy for that matter. So what Joe and I have in common is that we are both actually ambassadors for the North Carolina Talk It Out campaign. So we're getting the opportunity to go into schoolhouses, visit with youth groups, and travel all over and spread that prevention message, that all-important prevention message to prevent underage drinking. Troy is heavily engaged in the faith community and is getting all sorts of opportunities to engage youth in churches across the state, even in school gyms at times. And he's also hammering home that prevention message. And then Chris Butnick over at Healing Transitions, as we talked about prior to the webinar, Healing Transition has a very robust family program. And so by default, Chris and the Healing Place, they are indeed impacting our youth, providing those protective factors. And again, just another example of some folks in recovery doing some prevention work. On the flip side, now I have the fortunate opportunity for a whole lot of prevention professionals to interact with my staff at my agency at the Alcohol Drug Council. And, I think all of us are being mindful of the language that we're using, the word choice, helping to eliminate stigma and so forth. But ultimately, I just want every single participant on this webinar today to remain open-minded, think outside the box, so to speak, on different and creative ways on how you can make sure that prevention and recovery folks are working together in a unique way right there in your own community. So I want to thank the panel again. Do we have time for some Q&A for the panel, or do we need to?
We have 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So has anyone submitted any questions? Not yet? Okay.
Feel free to submit questions via the question box. We do have a interrelated question. If it's possible to obtain information about the Recovery Coach Academy,
okay,
and the contact information, brochures, flyers, and so forth. And I'm sure through Curtis and Mr. Mann, we can distribute that to individuals who are interested.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Again, we're going to move on, but if you do have questions or comments in reflection related to the panel or items spoken of prior to this next section, type those into the question box, and we will make sure to address those. Okay. So, Curtis, I'll let you transition us.
All right, and I believe we're only just about 20 minutes out from the conclusion of this particular event. So it looks like both Chris and Joe are going to be able to hang out with us for the remainder.
Yep.
All right, so they're both still present,
yep,
folks. If you have any questions for the panel members in particular. So I want to show you guys pretty incredible document, and I'd be remiss if I did not also thank the state of North Carolina for providing the funds associated with the creation of this document, the printing of this document, and the distribution of it. So my agency, we got a ton of help from Mr. Jamie Edwards and the TTA Center, as well as Ms. Jane Clark. She was with Clark Kinetics. She was also very instrumental in helping to develop this particular document. The title of it is Applying Prevention Strategies to Recovery Messaging. In a nutshell, its goals are simply to educate people on how to share their recovery story while using prevention strategies in order to cause no harm. So as a person in long-term recovery, and what that means for me is that I have not used alcohol or any other substance in over 16 years, I've been given the opportunity to share my story, share my testimony many, many times in front of a lot of people. And so, but whenever that audience is a youth group, when it's kids in middle school, elementary school, even high school for that matter, then I need to be mindful of what I'm sharing and the way that I'm sharing it. And so this document is an attempt to start that conversation, get people thinking about it beforehand, and just simply taking the time out to kind of do some research, get educated on what's appropriate and what's not, what's effective and what's not. Again, scare tactics are ineffective. Our stories can be used for inspiration and education. So the document also seeks to connect recovery and prevention by comparing those models. Recovery-oriented systems of care, for example, look identical, really, in the prevention and the recovery community. Also, seeing prevention as a peer support tool is vitally important in this day and age as we kind of embrace the effectiveness and the importance of peer support in our continuum of care. And it also discusses briefly why it's not too late. Like, just simply identifying as a person in recovery does not negate me from the ability to practice prevention in my life and to be an effective prevention professional. If this is your first time seeing this document, welcome to it. We do have more copies available in my office. One way you can get one would be to come on out to our awards luncheon, the ADCNC awards luncheon taking place on August the 1st. We can make sure you get more information about that as well. If you're not able to attend there, Jamie can make sure that everyone has my contact information. If you reach out to me, we can make sure to ship some of these documents out to your community.
The digital copy is actually downloadable via your webinar interface under handouts, as well as today's slides. Plus, the document will be emailed to everyone as well.
Thank you, Jamie.
In terms of digital copies,
that would be a much easier.
What's inside the document? The document was originally divided up into 5 categories: educating people on how to share their recovery story, as Chris mentioned, connecting recovery and prevention work. We spent some time defining prevention and recovery, and understanding the Institute of Medicine model, the continuum of care model, from promotion to prevention, treatment to recovery. We've added 3 new sections to the document that we'll spend the next 12 minutes or so talking about. The use of scare tactics in prevention and recovery. So if you have a copy of the document from even 2 weeks ago, that document does not include the new sections. The new section of scare tactics, language and stigma, which has actually been a topic today as well. And we've included a really short section on acronyms, common acronyms that exist across the human services field, the substance use field, from prevention to recovery and treatment. Many times we get lost in acronyms, and we're not sure what initials mean. Acronyms are kind of a dime a dozen these days. And sometimes it's the same letters that have different meanings across fields.
All right, thank you, Jamie. So the next topic is we're going to talk about stigma for a minute. So first, let's define stigma. Webster's Dictionary defines stigma as a mark or stain of discredit or shame. So we all know that stigmatizing language can stand as a barrier to people seeking treatment. There's a fear of being judged or discriminated against, and that can stand in the way of someone seeking the services that they so desperately need. Shouldn't be that way. There's a few things at play here. When a person is seen for a mental health and or substance use issue, society often believes that the individual should have enough control over themselves to correct the problem on their own. Language that creates stigma feeds into this. For example, a dirty urine versus a clean urine. Referring to someone as an addict or an abuser, a substance abuser. All of these terms are just the perpetuation of stigmatizing language. And as a result, people are dying every day just simply because they're too ashamed to let somebody know that they need help, that they do have an issue. Substance use disorder is a brain condition. There's chemical reactions taking place in that person's body. It's not a moral failing. It's not a weakness. There's no such thing as having enough control or enough willpower to overcome the disease of addiction. So everything that we can possibly do to help eliminate and eradicate stigma, that's what both the prevention and the recovery community absolutely must do. So changing people's mindsets to help eliminate stigma, it involves all of us. So because, for example, as a Talk It Out ambassador, when I go out and I talk to a youth group, the terms that I use, the language that I use, the terminologies, I'm teaching those young people on how they refer to people in recovery. How do they refer to someone who's having the disease of substance use disorder actively manifest itself in their life at that moment? What is their perspective? Do they think they're better than somebody? Do they think that others are less than? It's all about perspective, and our words are extremely powerful. So if we're intentional about this, and we think about the words and the phrases that we're going to use beforehand, then we can have a very healthy impact on society. And every time we get in front of a microphone or in front of any audience, then we're given that opportunity to help take another chunk out of that stigma. So, for example, physicians don't refer to people with diabetes as having their blood dirty with glucose. But we're quick to label a person challenged with a substance use disorder as popping a dirty urine. This type of language has to stop. It starts with us, especially prevention professionals, recovery professionals, treatment professionals, even the recovery community, for that matter. It all starts with us, the way that we introduce ourselves, what labels we give ourselves, and word choice. Words are extremely powerful. They can mean life or they can mean death in a lot of circumstances. Right now, you look around and, there's another overdose almost every single day. So, it's imperative, it's incumbent upon us to take a look at our word choice, participate in a recovery messaging training if you've never been to one, especially if you're being given opportunities to speak in public. But ultimately, we all must do our part to help eliminate stigma.
Thank you, Curtis. Again, stigma is one of the new sections that's included in the Alcohol Drug Council document. Another new section is that on scare tactics. And Stacy Stotler, one of our TTA staff, who is calling in this morning, will lead us through a few conversations about scare tactics.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I actually was pretty excited to talk about scare tactics. It's something I am passionate about, having 3 teenagers and seeing what schools see as a great idea for prevention messaging. So what are scare tactics? These are things that intend to scare an audience into behaving, some kind of way. Maybe it's going to scare them to stop a behavior, stop smoking, stop texting and driving, whatever that may be. Or it can also help to scare people into not starting. So, we see a lot of tobacco ads lately that have people who've gone through various surgeries, things like that. And it's basically intending to get kids, youth, other people to not engage in that behavior. So the technical definition would be that it emphasizes the worst dangers of drug use in order to create fear and anxiety in hopes that fear alone will prevent or stop those risky behaviors. They have been doing scare tactics for a very long time, and they've become quite good at them, to be honest. And we look back at over the years, and I don't know if any of you have seen a movie from the 1930s called Reefer Madness. This movie was basically put out as a huge scare tactic propaganda film to encourage people to see the demonized side of marijuana, that it was going to cause crime and suicide and all of these other things. That carried on for many, many years. Then we get into the 80s, and most of us are probably familiar with the commercial with the skillet and the egg in it. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? This ad has been revisited many times since the 80s. In the 90s, they did it again, specifically saying this is your brain on heroin, and it was an individual taking the skillet and smashing things around her. And it was just, again, to try to scare people into thinking that heroin was going to cause these violent side effects. Finally, in the 2000s, we kind of caught on to some research, and they re-released that ad. But at the end of it, it has some kids saying, wait, I do have questions, and encouraging parents to talk to their kids, encouraging teachers to talk with their students, and whatever, anyone else that might be in that position could do. In the 2000s, again, we have the Montana Meth Project. And I don't know, again, if you've seen these, they're worth looking up. They were some print ads and television ads that really depicted the scariest possible images surrounding drug use, drug overdose, any of those kind of things. And I mean, from a personal standpoint, I can remember sitting with my 10-year-old daughter when one of those commercials came on, and she hid under the covers because it scared her so badly. That's something that we really need to look at with our prevention messaging. Are we showing people something that they have to turn their eyes from? Are we showing people something that feels uncomfortable to look at, that they're not going to get the message because they can't even stand to look at it? So things like really graphic warnings, really graphic images. And it's not always people's favorite thing for me to say, but even the mock crashes that we see done at high schools across the country, these have been shown time and time again to be ineffective, especially as a standalone effort. When students see a mock crash, they frequently will tune that message out, laugh at it because, their good friends are participating in it, their good friends are actors in it, or they just blatantly do not believe that this is going to happen to them based on their own personal experiences or based on that all too familiar feeling that teenagers have that they are invincible. So we can get some pretty damaging results from these scare tactics. We can actually send kids in the opposite direction that we're intending because they don't really believe it. So if Jamie would go to the next slide for me, we can see that responses to fear, those responses don't stay static. After I've had a chance to reassess a situation, my response to fear is going to change because I have new information. If I keep hearing that fear message, it can irritate me, and it can just lead me to tune that information out completely. There are several ethical concerns with scare tactics. It can be viewed as a manipulation of a young individual who doesn't have necessarily the background or experience to kind of sort through that information. Those individuals can be very vulnerable. That also leads us into some questions regarding recovery stories. And Curtis pointed it out perfectly that there is definitely a place in prevention for recovery seekers or for families that have been impacted by, anything that might be a drunk driving crash or something like that. But we need to be sure that those speakers understand their audience, that youth are extremely impressionable. So some of those scary stories of overdose, those can really create some trauma in youth and various audiences. So we just need to be sure that the person speaking is comfortable speaking in front of kids. They are comfortable with, that inspirational information and those inspirational stories, not so much the scary stories. The final thing I want you to all think about is when you're looking at your prevention messaging or your recovery messaging and you're thinking about presenting it with youth, ask yourself if your students or your community is going to need help after this. So is my mock crash so vivid that they're going to maybe need help from a counselor to get through it? If that's the case, that's a scare tactic. And we need to be really, really careful that that's not the route we're taking.
Thank you, Stacy.
Absolutely.
Again, within the document is 3 really solid pages of material and references related to the historical uses of scare tactics and ways that we can change the narrative. The third new portion of the document is a listing of acronyms, and we have to most certainly, I think Ashley's on the webinar as well as a participant, Ashley Murdoch. Actually provided this list of acronyms, or we have added to, but 90% of it is actually Ashley's collection. She's a prevention specialist with Insight Human Services in the Statesville area, so we have to give full credit to Ashley for this idea. But we included 3 pages of acronyms that are commonly found in the prevention space. Many of these will be very familiar to you. Some might be new. Some examples. ATOD, of course, that's pretty common in our space in terms of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. We have CADCA, may not be as common in the recovery space. That's the Community Anti-Drug Coalition of America. The CADCA is a great resource in terms of prevention material, research, training, and training for community coalition members. Another common acronym, as an example, is CSAP. We've already heard from CSAP today, the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. Another one is that of CSAPC. That's the primary certification status for prevention professionals internationally and within North Carolina, certified substance abuse prevention consultant. And I wanted to share, as we close up, this is a map of, this is why we need the help of the recovery community. There are less than 60 individuals in this state who are certified substance abuse prevention consultants. And you can see the geographic distribution on the map. The gray counties, this is sorted by address, meaning the address of the credential holder. The gray counties, there are 0 certified prevention consultants living as a primary residence in that particular county. Then the counties, there are different shades of blue and white. You can see the numbers of certified folks in those counties. So certainly along your bordering counties, southernmost and western counties, and the Piedmont area, there's certainly a shortage of that, of certified folks. And this is really important, that there's not many individuals out there who, that we have many individuals promoting and providing prevention services, but in terms of meeting the professional standard, there's a small number inside the state. Many of you, as recovery professionals, may be interested in learning more about the prevention certification process and standard. And we at the TTA Center would love to help you with that. We're actually publishing a certification webinar series this fall in winter that will take someone from all 4 domains of prevention practice to test preparation and process. So if you're interested in learning more about those will be 30-minute clips that you can participate in at any time. Simply log in, and it's an independent self-learning module. It'll be free. So we certainly encourage you to participate in those. The Institute of Medicine model, with the acronym IOM, is very common in the field. And closing things up, NPN, you may run across. That is the National Prevention Network. The NPN is actually serves multiple roles. It is the organizing body of statewide leaders in the prevention space. It is also, the NPN serves as a training mechanism specifically for substance use prevention efforts and professionals in the field. The conference was in Boston last year. It was actually the best prevention conference I've ever attended. The conference for this year is in Chicago, and next year will be on the West Coast generally. So if you're really interested in getting a crash course in terms of prevention topics and basics in the prevention world, the NPN is a wonderful resource. Last but not least is what we call SUMPS within North Carolina, which is a substance use misuse prevention skills training. That is something that we deliver inside the state. It's basically a 2-day boot camp of prevention practices and processes specific to this state. If you're interested in attending that, it's free. We will probably hold SUMPS again this winter. We certainly encourage you to let us know, and you will be on the mailing list. We generally talk about prevention from A to Z at a really high level. Last but not least, this is 2 pages of an excerpt from the document that Curtis and his group has published, providing an example of its design and material. This one, for example, these 2 pages talk about the continuum of care model, why it's important, and scare tactics. And we provide links out to examples of scare tactics that may not be as effective as others. We know we're running a tad bit long, 5 minutes long, so we will stay online as long as we need to, and want to open up the Q&A section. This is the end of the formal piece of the webinar. We understand folks may have to leave with other obligations, and it's 11:50. We're slated to end at 11:45, but we will stay online to make sure all questions and issues we do the best we can to address. We want to thank you for your participation and attendance. After the webinar, 60 minutes afterwards, you will receive a link that asks you to complete a survey of today's webinar. Then by the end of by the end of the week, hopefully by tomorrow afternoon, you will receive a link providing the recording, access to today's recording, thank you, and the material. As folks start thinking about possible questions they want to ask, we do have a question for Joe from a participant. Mr. Marks talked about his past experience writing grants. What grants are available for small clinics in a community setting looking for funding for behavioral health and other substance use disorders?
Wow. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that specifically. However, I can tell you some of the grants that I worked on. One was through SAMHSA, and it did a fair amount of research on what grants were available through the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, and we received the Partnership for Success grant. With that grant, we were able to really build on a coalition, a substance use coalition we had in Burke County, which led to a DFC grant, which is a drug-free communities grant. However, locally, I worked really closely with our local United Way. United Way provided us funding year in and year out for different grants to support different programs we had going. The Community Foundation of Burke County helped us out tremendously year after year in the same vein. The Community Foundation of Western North Carolina, Sisters of Mercy, is another place to reach out to. There's all sorts of foundations that you can research and find out, and if you could leave your email address, or I can give you my email address, I can specifically go into a lot of my records and give you more and further information on that. So hopefully that at least got us started in the right direction.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. We will also include the email addresses for our panelists today, so you can reach out if you need to.
Yeah. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Thank you to Jamie Edwards and the NCTTA. Thank you, Joe Marks, Troy Mans, and Mr. Chris Budnick for serving on the panel discussion today. And thank you, Stacy, for your incredible work putting together the scare tactics language presentation and a few other things that you helped out with in today's presentation. On behalf of the Alcohol Drug Council and my incredible staff, just want to reiterate that we do provide information and referral to services for people challenged with substance use disorders. Our number is 800-688-4232. We also have the ability to chat with you directly from our website, which is www.alcoholdrughelp.org. Thank you again.
Thank you, Curtis. And I'll take my 60 seconds of my commercial as well and encourage folks to please feel free to contact the TTA Center. We frequently talk with individuals involved in the recovery space and the treatment space related to effective prevention practice and training opportunities and referrals to our sister agency, Community Impact NC, and other prevention providers statewide. So there is a network of over 20 prevention providers statewide that are funded via federal and state block grant resources that could be an excellent contact point for your prevention questions and activities and processes. So we'll be happy to help make those connections between your needs and community resources as well. Again, thank you so much for participating. We will leave the webinar active for another 3 or 4 minutes for possible questions. And Joe and Chris, any last words or comments before we take our leave of each other?
Just thank you again for the excellent work that you guys do organizing both this webinar and other trainings that you've done. You guys are top notch with your organization and appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, ditto. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Curtis. And thanks for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. Appreciate you guys.
Thank you so much.